Hi. So thanks for staying up towards the end. And this talk will be focusing on enabling ORAN use cases over Nephio. So this is the agenda that we kind of put together with what I put together with Seshu. So what we decided to is basically considering that many of you folks might be kind of having, may not be having that grounding within Nephio. So we'll be giving you a initial kind of view of the Nephio architecture, the kind of features that is available today with Nephio, the platform, and how the generality of it in terms of onboarding network functions and orchestrating them and so on. So that will be kind of giving you a snapshot of where Nephio is, and then Seshu will be talking more on the ORAN, kind of enabling the how part of this talk, where we'll be talking on how some of these ORAN use cases are being enabled on top of Nephio. Things that are related, and some of the use cases are listed here. What we have is the network function orchestration use case, the Oak Cloud K8s cluster creation use case, and so on. So so my focus, I'll be focusing here primarily on Nephio. So Nephio from a problem perspective, exactly what the scope of Nephio is. I mean, if you read into some literature of Nephio, you will see that. I mean, this is very commonly stated that it's a centralized domain-specific orchestration based on Kubernetes. So it builds on the success of Kubernetes, which is very commonly used today for container orchestration and so on. So we are taking it's basically taking the same design principles and the kind of the framework and the control machinery to kind of build a platform that basically would focus on problems related to infrastructure management, network function orchestration, and network function configuration. And if you see the right side of that's a popular figure that you might see within that's projected within the Nephio community, where you have the domain orchestration system, which is the Nephio domain orchestration system, and you have the 3 swim lanes, and basically the 3 larger set of use cases that are being realized within the Nephio community. And this architecture itself, as a domain orchestrator, you can apply it to different domains. So you could apply it to telco domain, and the focus primarily has been on the 5G domain for both core and RAN. You could also easily its applicability to enterprise and transport and so on as well. So the basic problem, there are multi-dimensional problems that Nephio tries to address. One of them is definitely about scale. How do you handle the scale of thousands of cloud sites? But at the same time, within an operator network, you also have the challenge that when you're actually deploying a service or a slice, you have to coordinate among multiple kind of technology stakeholders. For example, there are folks who are focused on the transport side, some focused on the RAN, the CAS side, or the cloud side, and then you have people on the core side of the network too. And if you really, and a service designer who has to stitch up all these things. So there is this aspect where from an orchestration perspective, you need pieces of information to kind of stitch up all this to kind of create that end-to-end slice. So from Nephio perspective, you are basically looking at this from the infrastructure perspective, looking at the network function, resource requirement, and trying to create that kind of a deployment. As I said, scale is one thing, and you can also talk about other problems related to software management. You can talk about a simple example of taking a network function, and when you're deploying it over a set of clusters with hundreds of parameters, and the idea is that it is not conceivable to do it manually, so you need automation out there. And Nephio primarily builds on the design principles of intent-driven automation, which we primarily talked about, which is primarily what Kubernetes is all about. Design to scale, configuration as data, and this is primarily coming from the fact that operator is a melting point, from a cloud provider perspective, network function vendor perspective. and the operator has to has to kind of take these blueprints, packages that is given to the operator from the vendor, and has to now customize for deployment and so on. So configuration as data is primarily about kind of separation of concerns, where you keep the configuration which can be acted upon by controllers for specialization and so on. And then accommodate different standard bodies. So Nephio it's not a standard specification body, but it's about, there is a thing about coming up with open APIs from an open source perspective, but it's about taking some of these standard specifications and kind of and making it enabling it and using it through Nephio by kind of by passing this information in a certain transparent manner to the network functions or the workload cluster and so on. So this is a recap of what has been released so far from an R1 and R2 perspective. So over the last 6 months, we have had 2 releases. So the last release, which is the R1 release, primarily focused on some kind of demonstrating some of the key principles of Nephio from a package specialization perspective. So this is basically saying that, okay, you could take a blueprint package that is from a vendor, and you could put it through a pipeline and then contextualize it for deployment. The other is basically saying that, okay, once you have a network function package, how do you kind of fan it out to multiple clusters? So, and in R1, what was used was primarily from the packages, the core packages from free 5GC deployment. Then from a R2 perspective, what happened was to kind of, the main kind of, the objective was to make it kind of more general in terms of multi-vendor kind of capability. So OAI was brought into the picture, and then some of the CRs, these APIs that Nephio was defining was generalized to kind of make it easy for any network function vendor to onboard their network function packages and kind of put it to the same kind of workflow and kind of prepare it for deployment. So we had this multi-vendor network function orchestration capability, multi-vendor workload cluster orchestration, and this was generalized for Google Cloud and Red Hat. And then you had, and also one of the features was to show the end-to-end 5G orchestration from vRAN and 5GC perspective. And then we had the some of the meta kind of the northbound APIs from a topology controller perspective and so on. And then there was also some new public-facing documentation that was released. The R3 release is where I think, which is more relevant to this audience, is where some of the ORAN use cases are being kind of realized. And we also have the R3 Developer Summit towards the later part of this week, where you could get a more kind of more comprehensive view of all these use cases that are coming out in R3. So this, so this is the R2 architecture. It's probably it's a kind of very busy slide, but the key point here is that going from R1 to R2, functionally the components did not change. But what I mentioned earlier was to kind of, it was generalization of the CRs that allowed you to bring in this multi-vendor capability. So as basically focusing on this on the right side figure, what you have here is you have 2 bigger kind of function, the clubbing of functions that's shown here. One is that's part of the management cluster. The other is part of the workload cluster. In the management cluster is basically the key domain orchestrator functions that reside there. So the central piece, what you have, one of the key pieces, what is there is the package orchestration system, which you call as a PORCH. And what PORCH does is to kind of, it interfaces with this external Git repos where all these blueprints of the network function vendor packages reside. It kind of makes those packages available within the management cluster. And then you have these specialization functions that acts on these packages to kind of finalize it for deployment. And then you have a bunch of other functions that are more that also are that were developed as part of R1 and into R2 to support workload cluster orchestration. You have something like the config sync, which basically does the GitOps kind of functionality for deploying to get the packages into the management cluster. From a workload cluster perspective, there is, of course, you have again the GitOps kind of the feature there through config sync, but there is also one of the enablers there is also the operators that is provided by the network function vendor himself, that basically takes in this the CRs that is finalized at the management cluster level, and then they render it for the final manifest that realizes the network function deployment. So yeah, so in the sense, like, as I said, the whole workflow here is, at least from a management cluster perspective, it's more or less service agnostic. It doesn't really dive into whether you're deploying a RAN, DU, or CUCP, or CUP, or a core function. You could use the same general machinery for putting the packages through a certain workflow and basically coming out with something that is deployable in the workload cluster. This operator-based network function deployment. So from a network function vendor himself, there are two pieces of information that is relevant. So there's one piece of information that is your blueprint packages that the vendor kind of uploads or kind of shares through the blueprint external repositories. And then there is a network function deployment. There's operator, network function operator himself, operator that the network function vendor develops, and which needs to be deployed in the workload cluster. And the interface between them is what is based on this network function deployment CR. Which we'll be discussing a little bit more in the next slides. But this is the basic operation of how a network function actually gets deployed. So you have the blueprint packages, and then you have the operator, and this operator can be written in primarily, it can be realized in multiple languages, and also there is some current existing mechanism for generating this operator code using the Helm charts that's existing today, which is the the standard way of doing things. So this is the blueprint. What I was the packages that is basically that is applied or given to the that is made available to the operator basically that is accessible through the Nephio management cluster. So what this package primarily contains is it has a bunch of CRs, which is highlighted here, like the dependency CR, the interface CR, the network CR, and the config CR. So what this includes is primarily information that is required by the operator that's working in the workload cluster to finally render their manifest for deployment within the network function itself, within the workload cluster. So for example, the dependency CR would include information, request information of other kind of network functions that this particular network function depends on. The interfaces is primarily about the secondary interfaces, the networks that it kind of maps to, and so on. And there is a way by which you can also kind of in a transparent way pass some certain config, certain service parameters through the network function, through this particular CR down to the workload cluster. So as I said, there are two main CRs that kind of makes it all generic. One is the network function deployment CR and the nfconfig CR. And so basically, these are taken by the network function operators that is functional in the workload cluster to generate these final deployments. And so to basically give a few more details on the network function deployment CR, so it includes information related to who is actually providing whom it's targeted to in terms of there's a provider parameter in the spec, then you have the NF config, which includes all the other kind of the API version kind of different resources that is required by this particular operator to finalize their manifest. And then you have the information related to the networking information, so on. So I've been flagged. So then you have the config CR through which your other dependency information is also passed, and so on. So there's a lot. I'm not going to the weeds of this, but I'll pass it on here to Seshu. So this is other CR that is there. I mean, this is all there it's documented in the Nephio website. You could go and read about it. But I think the more interesting part is the one related to Nephio ORAN integration. Sorry.
You gave me 3 minutes.
I know, man. I'm sorry.
Guys, I'm supposed to speak for 10 minutes. I just got 2 minutes more. Thanks, Ravi. And the interesting part is going to come in 2 minutes to you. So let me go in rapid fire. So basically the focus has been like this, that Nephio ORAN architecture, the primary focus has been to get, we spoke about it, right? Our friends, David spoke about it. Even Ganesh was talking about the way we are trying to do collaboration. Even John spoke about it as part of his thing. So I'll not go into that part of it, but in precise, what I can say you is that what we are trying to do here is trying to find a low-lying fruit. Instead of reinventing wheel, we want to find the collaboration between different communities and see how we can leverage, share our ideas. That's where Shankar also is working on with respect to disaggregation of SMO. So all these thoughts have been put forward, and we are trying to find how we can leverage what is already there from Nephio and how we can bring into the OSC part of it. And then that becomes a feedback loop. I'm sorry I'm not reading the slides because I've got only 2 minutes now. Next important thing is the ORAN use cases which we are trying to do this. Here I would say Nephio becomes enabler. We are not just focusing on Nephio. Nephio becomes enabler from what we have seen from Ravi's presentation before. So here mainly what we are looking at is how we can do the integration between OSC, Nephio, and OI, all three put together. OI becomes the workload as such. We are getting the workloads from OI, the CU, DU are what we are taking from there. OSC is enabler for you to have the end-to-end orchestration piece, and then Nephio becomes as one more piece for the cloud native thing. So what we have also looking at both HC profile as well as the KTS profile. KTS profile is what we want to do from Nephio side. HC profile is what we want to do from a Tacker part, again coming from the OpenStack part of it. So together we have these all things. We are talking about the FOCOM, NFO orchestration. We are also talking about the create workload cluster. That's actually the part of the end-to-end orchestration piece. Deploy near real-time rig, okay? And then finally reconfigure the ORAN SC INF. That's the part which is to be talked about. So this is another way of looking at it from both the integration. When we overlap the Nephio and the ORAN SC slides together, what we get is something like this. Here, as you see, the management cluster is something which is the IMS piece, and the workload cluster is actually what we are talking about, DMS piece, coming from the OSC side. So we have a SMO piece which also is coming on the management cluster from Nephio. So here you can see the overlap, how OSC and Nephio will tie together. When you bring those two communities together, what will look like. So this has been discussed a lot. We got both the consortiums of Nephio as well as the OSC and ORAN coming together, having a lot of discussion on it, and we are trying to find a matchmaking between all of them. This is one of the slides which, again, is talking about the blue piece. The blue piece is what we have taken as a Nephio R2. The remaining piece actually is the complete use case. Nephio being a workload cluster, it can do for any use case. This was one of the use cases where we are trying to have it for the ORAN specific. And again, I know I'm going very fast. I'm already up the time, but I'll try to squeeze in.
Yes, donated 5 minutes to you.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks, Alex. So I don't know if I can complete in 5 minutes too, but I'll try to. So the main part here is that what we are trying to do is the blue box is what we have taken from Nephio R2. The remaining pieces are actually coming from the other sides of it, and we are trying to have an end-to-end use case. The main thing here is the RAN KTS operator, because we want to have an operator-based deployment of the workloads, the NFs which are coming in. So we want to have the RAN KTS operator as the enabler for this, and that is the matchmaker between Nephio community or Nephio principalities around the KTS orchestration and how we can do it for ORAN-specific use cases. These are the APIs which we have found. Here, the main thing is we found as part of the implementation, there are some of the APIs which are not yet defined or not yet completely standardized, especially the API 0, which you're talking about, create cluster, also the query cluster. These two is something which we didn't find it in the thing, so we are having a stopgap solution there. Similarly, even the entry point into FORCOM NFO, because we have service orchestration being there, as we speak about it, it's getting more and more synthesized of it from the work group 1 and also from the ORAN community. So we also want to keep them as part of. So we found a shop group solution for the R3 release right now, also for the H release and I release. As we get more and more clarity about it, we'll also include that in the standard process. That's what we are trying to do. So this is something which is an amalgamation of both existing APIs as well as new APIs. And together is what we want to have an end-to-end solution which can be showcased for the current release. So, and then we will also have it as we speak, as we have more and more clarity about the APIs to be made, we'll get the clarity of it. And that goes R3 plus of Nephio as well as the IN release, above I release of OSC also. These are the use cases which we have for R3 and beyond, where we are mainly talking about the integration for Nephio and the SMO. The main thing here, again, everything is actually as per Nephio community, but what we have mainly is a config spec state. The package is synced, and that's actually coming as part of the config spec. So it's what we are taking is basically the Kubernetes way of deploying is what we want to keep as the ideology behind NF orchestration also. And the same is what we'll try to have it for even for the RAN-based use cases. With that, edge clusters will be able to brought up, and this is what we have for the near real-time based things. And John has actually talked about this as part of his previous thing also, near real-time. So this is also something which we want to keep as an ideology behind. The actual thing of it will come as part of our next implementations. So reconfigure ORAN NF is also something similar, where we will try to have the update config map. What we just saw before was the config map deployment. Here we have an update config map. So these, as I said, these last three things which I'm talking about are theories which can be taken from Nephio side of it and implement into ORAN SE. So we will actually take it as a proper use case and have an end-to-end implementation. Yeah, I think I'm at your time. Thanks, Alicia, for being here.